All right, everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Joanna Cohn. I'm director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I am absolutely delighted and honored to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Mitch Zeller. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from Mitch just 1 month since he retired from his 9 years as director of the United States Food and Drug Administration's Center for Tobacco Products. In his role as center director, Mitch provided the strategic vision to use the tools of product regulation to make tobacco-caused death and disease part of America's past. Mitch is trained as a lawyer and has worked on FDA-related issues for 40 years. He began his career as a public interest attorney in 1982 at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. 6 years later, he became counsel to the Human Resources and Intergovernmental Relations Subcommittee of the House of Representatives Government Operations Committee, where he conducted oversight of enforcement of federal health and safety laws. And then, in 1993, Mitch joined the staff of then FDA Commissioner Dr. David Kessler. And what began as a 2-week assignment by Kessler in 1994 to examine the practices of the tobacco industry led to his serving as Associate Commissioner and director of FDA's first Office of Tobacco Programs. In that role, Mitch was instrumental in crafting the FDA's 1996 tobacco regulations. He also represented FDA before Congress, federal, and state agencies. And of importance for those of us who do global tobacco control work, Mitch also served as an official U.S. delegate to the World Health Organization's Working Group for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Then in 2000, Mitch took on the role of Executive Vice President of the American Legacy Foundation, where he oversaw communications, activities, and strategic partnerships, and he created the foundation's first Office of Policy and Government Relations. In 2002, Mitch joined Pinney Associates as Senior Vice President, and his work focused on providing strategic planning and communications advice on domestic and global public health policy issues involving the treatment of tobacco dependence and the regulation of tobacco products and pharmaceuticals. 11 years later, Mitch assumed the role of director of the FDA's Center for Tobacco Products. Now, I have known Mitch for about 15 years. I had the privilege of collaborating with him on a project where we developed and proposed criteria that could be used to assess the appropriateness and acceptability of a funding model that used tobacco company funds for research activities. And as always, Mitch was insightful, visionary, and practical. And I remember soon after taking the job as CTP director, Mitch described what he was experiencing as holding on to a speeding train by his fingernails. Well, he survived that and more, and I'm so excited to hear Mitch Zeller's reflections on his 28 years of focus on tobacco and nicotine regulation. So please join me in warmly welcoming Mitch Zeller to the podium.
Well, thank you, Joanna, for that really kind and thorough introduction of my career, and let me just return the favor. The collaboration that Joanna and I did on the issue of how to be thinking about tobacco industry funding of research was something that we did over a 9 to 10 year period. We did a lot of convening, primarily at the meeting of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. where we had the tobacco industry at the table with us initially for discussions, and it all culminated, I think, 8 or 9 years later in the paper that Joanna described, and it was a true labor of love. We thought then, and I look back on it now as making an important contribution. If the emotions on all sides of that debate can be set aside, because it's a framework that works if one brings a degree of objectivity and reasonableness to the considerations of, should I take money from a tobacco company or an e-cigarette company or not? So I encourage everybody to go back to that paper that Joanna was the lead author on in Nicotine and Tobacco Research in 2009. But that's not why I'm here today. It's in discussions with Joanna, it's to have the first opportunity, now that I am retired, to take a few liberties that I wouldn't have had if I was still serving as center director at FDA, but to look back on the last 28 years of my what turned out to be almost 40-year career working on FDA-related issues. So here's what I'd like to do with the talk, and I've divided it into 4 chapters or sections. First, I'm going to make the case for, or try to make the case for, regulation of tobacco products by an agency like FDA. It's sort of to set the stage before you'll join me in a time machine, and we're going to take a look at the past, what the tobacco industry said and what they knew about nicotine and when they said and knew those things. And then working our way forward, what FDA tried to do in the 1990s to play catch up with the industry, and then ultimately what Congress did to step in the 2000s. Then I'll talk about the present and the marketplace for nicotine products today, and what some of the promises but also some of the challenges are when it comes to thinking about the marketplace for nicotine, hopefully informed by what we will have covered up to that point. And then drill down into the issues raised by harm reduction and the reality that, at least in the US, and I should say this is a completely US-focused presentation, the reality of the role of pre-market review for new products and claims here in the US. And then I'll close with a look towards the future. No crystal ball, but some thoughts and some opinions, starting with the potential for nicotine reduction in combustible tobacco products, some questions that I think we all should be grappling with, and then I'll have some reflections on the current harm reduction debate. But let's start with why regulation. And this involves something of a look back to the historically unregulated marketplace for tobacco products that had existed for the better part of a half century or more in the United States. And during that long period of time, what the main tobacco companies did was deny. They denied addiction and they denied causality. And they did that quite successfully for a very, very long period of time. We began to see sort of tactically how they did that and how they were so successful in fending off litigation, any possible regulation, when in the 1990s, all of those previously secret internal industry documents started coming out. And one of the more remarkable set of documents, ironically titled Project Truth, from B&W, which is Brown and Williamson, which was then the 3rd largest cigarette company in the United States. The Project Truth documents reveal how they framed their approach to denial and injecting doubt. And in fact, this is one of the most famous quotes from any of the previously secret industry documents. Doubt is our product. That was the cornerstone of, again, the ironically titled Project Truth. And the company was explicit in what their objectives were. And objective number 1 was to set aside in the minds of millions the false conviction that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and other diseases, a conviction based on fanatical assumptions, fallacious rumors, unsupported claims, and the unscientific statements and conjectures of publicity-seeking opportunists. And this wasn't the 1930s or the 1940s or the 1950s. This was 1969. So during those decades of the historically unregulated marketplace, in addition to the clever strategy and accompanying tactics of denying and injecting doubt into any questions of health concerns. In the absence of regulation, it was the companies that decided which products got introduced. It was the companies that decided what modifications, if any, would be made to products that were currently on the market. And it was the companies that decided what kind of claims, if any, would be made, express or implied for those products. And a public health price was paid for the lack of regulation in the marketplace. And the best example of that for me is every time there was a series of health concerns raised about cigarettes, in the absence of regulation, it was the industry that responded with modifications to the products to respond to those health concerns. In the 1950s, it was the filtered cigarette. In the 1960s and the 1970s, it was the so-called light and low-tar cigarette. And again, in the absence of regulation, what we wound up with the filter cigarette was the Kent Micronite filter, which was a filter that was lined with asbestos. And with the light and low-tar cigarette, we wound up for decades with a product that was extremely popular with health-concerned smokers, which when measured on smoking machines actually delivered less tar and less nicotine. But the industry knew that machines didn't smoke like human beings, and that when human beings smoked those same products, the reductions in tar and nicotine either disappeared or were much, much lower. In the absence of independent science, government and health authorities assumed a public health benefit for smokers who switched to these products. And an enormous public health price was paid for those decades of the historically unregulated marketplace. So what do we get with product regulation? And I just want to give a couple of high-level examples before we go on our tour through the time machine. For me, the most fundamental difference is you now have a science-based regulatory agency playing this vital gatekeeper role that FDA has played for all the other products that it regulates for decades, and that the public has come to expect. That the kind of consumer protection that comes with that gatekeeper function, standing between companies that want to bring new products or claims to market and the users of those products. And in a regulated marketplace, the decisions about whether new products and new claims can come to market are science-based, and they're made by an independent regulatory agency, not by product developers and marketers at tobacco companies. And under the legal framework that Congress has established, which we'll get to in just a minute, the burden is clearly 100% on each company to demonstrate that the marketing of a new product or the making of a new claim is appropriate. And those standards under the current law are high standards. Okay, so with that, I wasn't trying to persuade you about the benefits or the values of product regulation, but I thought that would be a good framing before we get into the time machine and go back and take a look at what they knew and when they knew it when it comes to nicotine. We're going to go back to 1963. 1963 was the first year before the first ever Surgeon General's report on smoking and health in the United States. But for purposes of this talk, maybe more importantly, 1963 was a quarter of a century before the Surgeon General was able to conclude that the nicotine in cigarettes was addictive. That did not happen until the Surgeon General's report in 1988.
In 1963, a man named Addison Yeaman, who was, and I'll come back to Mr. Yeaman later, who at the time was the top lawyer for Brown and Williamson, major cigarette company, Addison Yeaman wrote the following.
Nicotine is addictive. We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. My dear friend and colleague Joe Gitchell has seen me use this quote for a very long time, and I keep on coming back to it. And I keep on coming back to it because of the impact that it's had with me over the years since I saw it for the first time in the 1990s. And to me, the power of this quote, coming from a lawyer, not a scientist, not an addiction expert, and in 1963, the power of this quote is as much what it doesn't say as what it does. He doesn't say they're in the tobacco business. He doesn't say they're in the cigarette business. He says we're in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. And I think that we all need to bear that in mind as I take you through the history, but more importantly, as we then get up to the present day. Because one of the points that I'm trying to make with this talk is nothing's really changed in terms of the true nature of the marketplace. It's a marketplace for nicotine.
Addison Yeaman
Said this secretly and privately in a document that remained secret and unavailable to the public for 30 years. But he knew. And if the lawyer knew, that means that everybody else at the company knew. Philip Morris in 1972 said that the cigarette's a product, it's not a package. The product is nicotine. The pack is a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. And the cigarette is a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. And very importantly, the puff of smoke is a vehicle of nicotine. And we're going to come back to this concept of vehicles or platforms for delivering nicotine as we see the changes in the marketplace over the last 50, 60, or 70 years. R.J. Reynolds in 1972 said the tobacco industry may be thought of as being a specialized, highly ritualized, and stylized segment of the pharmaceutical industry. Tobacco products uniquely contain and deliver nicotine, a potent drug with a variety of physiological effects. Remember, this is smack in the middle of the decades of denying addiction and denying causality, but this is what they wrote, and this is what they knew privately. And there's a really interesting Reynolds document, same vintage, with observations on the so-called confirmed smoker. Now, for the next couple of slides, be very aware of the euphemisms, really powerful and important euphemisms that are built in. So for the confirmed smoker, Reynolds says, pattern and usage primarily determined by individual nicotine dosage requirements. Industry based upon design, manufacture, and sale of attractive dosage forms of nicotine. That was the Reynolds insight into the confirmed smoker. Now what about what they identified as the pre-smoker or non-smoker? Actually, just think about the concept of a pre-smoker. Is there some sense of inevitability that that person is going to become a smoker if the Reynolds of the world had anything to do with it? So look at the euphemisms here. For the pre-smoker or non-smoker, things which keep a confirmed smoker habituated and satisfied, unknown, largely explained to the non-smoker. Only after experiencing smoking for some period of time do the physiological satisfactions and habituation become apparent and needed. And this last part is, to me, remarkable. We must somehow convince this pre-smoker or non-smoker with wholly irrational reasons to try smoking in the hope that they will discover the real satisfactions obtainable. British American Tobacco just reduced the whole thing to one quick thought. BAT should learn to look at itself as a drug company rather than as a tobacco company. And the now defunct Tobacco Institute, the trade association for US cigarette companies, said the entire matter of addiction is the most potent weapon a prosecuting attorney can have in a lung cancer cigarette case. We can't defend continued smoking as free choice if the person was addicted. But of course, that's exactly what they were doing and continued to do well into the 1990s and early 2000s. So that's what they said about nicotine. Now, what did they know about nicotine and other health effects, and when did they know it? And this is a story that I want to tell by relying on a couple of documents from the vast collection of Philip Morris documents that became publicly available for the first time in the 1990s. And the first part of the story comes from a document that's titled Development of Practical Methods for Modifying Cigarette Smoke to Give Minimum Lung Retention. Here's what the story that the documents tell. So there were some Philip Morris executives that had a company, Battelle, under contract. Battelle's a contract research and laboratory organization. And Philip Morris had asked Battelle to put a proposal together for a study of practical methods whereby the particle size of cigarette smoke might be altered to minimize lung retention. And in this document, they lay out the proposal that they're looking for, a plan of research that will be followed when attacking the problem of altering the particle size of cigarette smoke with a view to reducing lung retention. So that's the what. Now, why? Why was Philip Morris, with the assistance of Battelle, interested in figuring out how to alter the particle size of particles in cigarette smoke to minimize lung retention? They had figured out, when looking at this particle size in cigarette smoke, that many of the particles were approximately 1 micron in diameter. And they had figured out that that 1 micron diameter particle of smoke optimized retention of smoke in the lungs. And they realized privately, and with the use of some powerful euphemisms, which you'll see in just a sec, that they had a dilemma. They recognized that there was a public health dilemma. If most of the particles were 1 micron in diameter, and that was the optimal particle size to maximize the retention of smoke particles in human lungs. So they said, well, it's undesirable in that it maximizes, it has high retention of tar particles, but it's desirable because there's the maximum retention of physiologically active components. Both Philip Morris and Patel realized that there was an imperative here, and the imperative was preserve the physiological response. If the size of the particles were to be changed, alternative means might be required to increase the alkaloid content in the smoke. So they saw the dilemma, and they wanted assistance to figure out how to go about minimizing lung retention, which of course they wound up never doing. But Patel was on the case. Patel got very excited, and in a follow-up to a Philip Morris executive, they said, well, what we need to be looking at is a concept of developing what might be termed an instant cigarette, where those physiologically active components might be dispersed in the form of an aerosol through a metered device to simulate a puff of a cigarette. Sound familiar? And Patel went on to say, well, this of course is going to require an understanding of some of the addictive aspects of nicotine and associated alkaloids. The important consideration is not tobacco, but the reaction resulting from the nicotine. And Patel then touts the laboratory capabilities both of Philip Morris and Patel and says, in order to get the physiological reaction, extremely important to have the particle size such as to yield rapid absorption through the lung. And then Patel concludes, as long as the system achieved its quota of nicotine, it would make little difference whether the alkaloid was secured from smoke or from a mist. So this last anecdote or story explains how scientifically sophisticated the industry's understanding was, right down to the particle size in smoke and what the public health trade-offs were. So the question is, well, when did they know all this? When did that particle size research that Patel did begin? When did Patel submit that proposal? When did Philip Morris engage in those internal discussions, which then led to doing nothing? And when was Patel talking about something that sounded very much like a prototype for the e-cigarette? The research was done as early as 1957. The proposal that I described was submitted in 1959. The Philip Morris internal discussion about which way to go was 1959. And that Patel proposal for something that was looking and sounding very much like an e-cigarette was presented to Philip Morris in 1959. So fast forward to the 1990s, my first stint at FDA, and we can call it sort of playing catch-up, right? Because given everything that they knew about nicotine, they had a 50-year head start on us as regulators. And as regulators, FDA has been playing catch-up ever since. Now, in order to have any hope of regulating tobacco products, primarily cigarettes and smokeless tobacco products, in the 1990s, there was one other thing that FDA was going to need to do, and that was to overcome the so-called flavor and taste argument. Remember, this is still in the middle of the decades of denial and doubt, though the industry didn't deny that nicotine was an important part of the smoking experience. But they said the significance of nicotine was its flavor and taste, while denying addiction. So we were going to have to overcome that, which we did. Those industry documents that I've just given you some sampling from were all authentic and finally proved 30, 40 years later that the companies knew that they were in the nicotine business and that they knew that nicotine was addictive. We had informants. At the time, we had current industry employees and former industry employees that provided a valuable public service at some personal risk to sort of guiding us through how cigarettes are made, scuttled research, interpretation of documents. And we'd done our own investigation, and we'd gathered a ton of evidence on the independent manipulation and control of nicotine by the cigarette companies, whether it was through the blending of different tobacco leaves with different nicotine levels, the use of laboratory chemistry to alter the pH of tobacco smoke to make the smoke more pharmacologically active, or the genetic modification of the leaf itself to either raise nicotine levels or lower nicotine levels. All of those were examples of the complete control and manipulation of nicotine levels in cigarettes and smokeless tobacco, for that matter. It led to an assertion of jurisdiction in 1996, as Joanna said in her introduction. And there was a period of time from 1997 to 2000 when I was the director of this tiny little Office of Tobacco Programs, initially funded out of discretionary dollars from then Commissioner Kessler. Under the terms of a court order, the only parts of that 1996 rule, which had advertising restrictions, marketing restrictions, the only part of that 1996 rule that we were allowed to enforce from 97 to 2000 were the youth access restrictions. But for the first time, there was some federal regulation of tobacco products. But 15 minutes after we asserted jurisdiction in the summer of 1996, we were sued by advertisers, manufacturers, growers, and retailers. 4 different federal district courts. It was all consolidated into one case and led to what is known as the Brown and Williamson decision in the Supreme Court in 2000. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court overturned the FDA assertion of jurisdiction. And what that meant was that we had to shut the whole thing down. And personally, it's why I left FDA. I could have stayed, but I couldn't have continued to work on tobacco, and I wanted to continue working on tobacco, and that's why I went to the Legacy Foundation. So what do we need to know about what was really on the Supreme Court's mind in this Brown and Williamson decision? And I think it comes down to just a few thoughts. And what the court said was, FDA's asserted jurisdiction to regulate an industry constituting a significant portion of the American economy. Owing to its unique place in American history and society, tobacco has its own unique political history. I guess I missed that day in political science when I was an undergraduate as a government and policy studies major. I didn't know that tobacco had its own unique political history. But this is really what the Brown and Williamson decision came down to, with the court saying, basically, FDA should not be in the business of deciding whether this product, for these reasons, should be regulated by a regulatory agency. Only Congress should be able to make that decision, and as a political matter. And with that, we waited and waited for Congress to figure out what to do while completely shutting down the FDA program. And Congress did step in, but it took them 9 years. So Brown and Williamson was March of 2000, and passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act was June of 2009. And I'm not going to go through the whole statute. I think for purposes of what we're talking about today, what I want to focus on in the statute is the key provisions in the law that relate to pre-market review of new products and claims. The standard under the law for e-cigarettes and any other electronic nicotine delivery system is you get to market if the marketing of the product would be, in the words of the statute, appropriate for the protection of the public health. And again, as framed and ordered by Congress, these were to be case-by-case decisions based upon the evidence that a company submitted in an application on a product-by-product basis. And the companies needed to demonstrate that the benefits to adults outweighed the risk to kids. That's only a little bit of an oversimplification, and especially when it comes to flavored products. So this isn't some kind of regulatory, abstract, categorical determination of this kind of product good, that kind of product bad. Application by application, case by case, product by product. And the statute makes absolutely clear that the legal and the evidentiary burden is squarely on the company and their application. We issued something called the Final Deeming Rule in 2016, which then gave FDA regulatory authority over all products, starting with e-cigarettes, cigars, pipes, and hookah, that met the then statutory definition of a tobacco product, which is anything that's made or derived from tobacco and intended for human consumption. Okay, so we've looked at what the industry knew and when they knew it. We've looked at the sort of chapter 1 of the regulatory history. And so now we're up to the present. So let's drill down to the marketplace for nicotine and what I see, at least, as some of the promises and challenges.
Remember I said Addison Yeaman was the lawyer who wrote that remarkable document in 1963?
He was right then, and he's no longer with us, but he predicted the future. This remains, and this will always be a marketplace for nicotine. The difference is, compared to 1963, 1973, 1983, now the nicotine can be delivered without burning tobacco leaves and having to inhale that smoke in order to get the nicotine. And part of the promise and part of the challenge is the nicotine doesn't directly cause the cancer, the lung disease, and the heart disease. Depending upon the vehicle, remember that other quote about the vehicle of nicotine, depending upon the type of vehicle, depending upon how addictive the product and the pathway in the vehicle is, certainly the nicotine is the reason why someone can become addicted to a product. But if you become addicted to a cigarette, the cancer and the lung disease and the heart disease is coming from other chemicals. When you burn tobacco leaves, about 7,000 different chemicals so far have been identified in cigarette smoke. And included in that family of 7,000 chemicals are the chemicals that are directly associated with cancer, lung disease, and heart disease. We need to remember that the nicotine, and I've said this in the past, it's not a completely safe and benign compound, and I don't agree with those who equate it with caffeine. Having said that, for purposes of understanding the nicotine marketplace, the nicotine doesn't directly cause the cancer, lung disease, and heart disease. But we have concerns because depending upon that vehicle, that platform, it can be very addictive. And we have concerns about the popularity of flavors with kids and the reality that kids are experimenting now with a pulmonary delivery of nicotine into the lungs that has the potential to be addictive. So what are the implications for all this? For harm reduction opportunities, given the reality of that statute that Congress created and the reality of pre-market review, gatekeeper role for the regulator. Well, the first point that needs to be made explicitly is the continuum of risk is real. There are more or less harmful ways to deliver nicotine. But the continuum of risk it's an abstract notion. It's real, but it's abstract, if that's not an inconsistency. But it needs to be acknowledged that there's a spectrum out there. And why don't we say that not much disagreement as to the anchor points. Cigarettes being the most harmful form of nicotine delivery at one end, and not e-cigarettes, but medicinal nicotine products like gum, patch, and lozenge as being the least harmful form of nicotine delivery at the other end. And we can debate for days and weeks and months where to put other products somewhere along that spectrum. But the continuum is real. And it's also clear that the hypothetical pack-a-day smoker, otherwise unable or unwilling to quit, who manages to completely switch to an e-cigarette, is definitely going to be reducing their risk. But the marketing authorization decisions that FDA has to make are not based upon any kind of abstract or categorical approach. The Tobacco Control Act, with those pre-market review provisions that I described, clearly placed the burden on each company to demonstrate on a case-by-case basis that the benefits outweigh the risks. And so what that leaves us with, and I'll try to state this as objectively as I can, is a whole bunch of inconvenient truths. But this is equal opportunity, because these are inconvenient truths for those on both sides of the harm reduction debate and for certain members of Congress. For those who bring all the concerns about alternative products, starting with e-cigarettes, to the table, the reality is that there are certain heated products, smokeless products, and e-cigarette products that have met the appropriate for the protection of the public health standard and have earned and deserved the marketing authorization that they have received from FDA. And that also includes a VLN, or very low nicotine cigarette. There's even a cigarette that met the appropriate for the protection of the public health standard because of the alteration of nicotine delivery. And a subset of these products have also passed the test to be authorized to make exposure or risk reduction claims. And in the month and a half since I retired, there have been more marketing authorizations coming out of FDA, and certainly more to follow. But for the proponents of e-cigarettes, there are also some inconvenient truths. The flavored e-cigarette products that have been reviewed by FDA so far have all failed on a case-by-case basis to pass that appropriate for the protection of the public health test. Why? Because the companies failed to make the case on the benefits side. And so whatever marketing restrictions or youth access restrictions they built into their applications didn't matter. They were insufficient to overcome the deficiencies in the critical part of the review, which is, have you made the case of benefit to addicted adults? And that's the principal reason why, so far, the flavored e-cigarette applications have failed. Okay, the final chapter, and no crystal ball, but some observations and some thoughts and, I guess, opinions about the future. So let's start with the potential for nicotine reduction in combustible products. We can't fundamentally alter the safety and toxicity profile of a cigarette. If at the end of the day, you're going to be burning tobacco leaves and inhaling all that stuff into your lungs, it's a deadly, dangerous, toxic product. But what if that same product could no longer create or sustain addiction? Well, FDA absolutely has the authority to do that under what's known as the product standard provisions of the Tobacco Control Act. And my opinion, the regulatory science supports it. When I was center director, we did some dynamic population level modeling. We brought in outside experts through a process known as expert elicitation to independently generate the assumptions that were built into the model. And so these are projections through the end of the century from this one policy that would prevent future generations of kids that the tobacco industry and those previously secret documents had identified as the replacement smokers for addicted adult smokers who died or quit. Future generations of kids will experiment with cigarettes, but what if the cigarette that they were experimenting with could not create or sustain addiction? Well, modeled out through the end of the century, more than 33 million Americans who would otherwise have gone on to become regular smokers, gone from initiation and experimentation to regular smoking. More than 33 million Americans who would have become regular smokers wouldn't. And as a result, we would have an adult smoking rate of under 1.5%. And you add all of that up, and again, through the end of the century, more than 8 million tobacco-caused deaths, not cases of cancer, lung disease, and heart disease, actual deaths. More than 8 million deaths could be averted through the end of the century from this one rulemaking. But this would raise some profound questions about access to nicotine. Because even though we have historically low smoking rates, there are still more than 30 million Americans who smoke. Their brains have been rewired by their cigarettes. And the nicotinic receptors in their brains don't know from FDA and really don't know from cigarettes or e-cigarettes. They just know that they're seeking, in the words of those very prescient older documents, they're seeking the next dose. And that smoker that you see out on the street is puffing away to stave off the symptoms of withdrawal because the receptors are waiting to be fed their next dose of nicotine. So in a world where combustible products, the most remarkably efficient nicotine delivery mechanism that has ever been created, is no longer capable, thanks to regulation, of creating or sustaining addiction, what do we do for those 30+ million Americans who are going to, many of whom are still going to be seeking nicotine? And in that world, what are the implications for alternative and potentially less harmful nicotine delivering products that would not be affected by this policy? What has been under discussion is nicotine reduction only in combustible products. Now, there's a whole separate debate and question that could take place about, well, what about the nicotine levels in non-combustible products? But the idea to date has been render the deadliest, most dangerous products minimally or non-addictive, and don't touch the nicotine content of alternative and less harmful products in a properly regulated marketplace. So as divisive as all of this has been with the advent of e-cigarettes and the pitched camps in tobacco control and public health. Over the years in talks that I gave, and then in this very brief paper that I published a couple years ago in Nicotine and Tobacco Research, I posed a series of questions to see if, rather than continuing the unproductive debate of harm reduction good, harm reduction bad, continuum of risk, is it real or not, e-cigarettes good, e-cigarettes bad, is there some other way to get at all this through a series of questions that if we brought the combatants together might help generate dialogue, genuine dialogue, and common ground? And so here are the questions. And these are not just questions for those of us in the field. These are questions for society. How comfortable are we going to be with long-term and possibly permanent use of less harmful nicotine delivery mechanisms by adults, if that's what it takes to keep currently addicted smokers from relapsing to the most harmful nicotine delivery products out there, which are combustible tobacco products? How comfortable are we with that? Or to put it another way, how much weight should be placed on, how concerned should we be if, as part of this transition to less harmful products, there's less interest in quitting nicotine altogether? Because there's sort of two parts to this. The first part is easy, getting as many people tobacco-free as possible. A lot of agreement there. But the second part, which is very much open for discussion, is, but should they also be nicotine-free? And that's a conversation that we all need to have. And are we willing to pay a price if we could get a whole bunch of current smokers to completely switch to less harmful products, if they wind up on those products for a longer period of time, and that there's diminished interest in getting off of all nicotine-delivering products? And then there's the complicated issue of dual use of various tobacco products. Dual use can cut both ways. The easiest example is a smoker that continues to smoke while vaping. Well, how many cigarettes per day or per week are they still smoking if they're now engaging in vaping as well as smoking? Are they dramatically reducing their cigarettes per day? Or are they not reducing, or is it only a minimal reduction? So given that dual use can cut both ways, are we okay with some short period of dual use for those who need it transitionally to move from the more harmful products to the less harmful products? Here's the tougher question. What if that period of dual use has to take place over a much longer period of time? And what about permanent dual use? If we're seeing benefit, they may still be smoking, but they're not smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, and there's demonstrable benefit to occasional smoking. But it's the use of the alternative products that is keeping them from relapsing to the pack a day. We haven't really talked at all about medicinal nicotine products, but in this marketplace for nicotine, what can be done to revise the labeling and the indications of all those medicinal nicotine products where there are no safety issues? The gum patch and lozenge are available over the counter and have been for decades. And the only reason why FDA ever authorizes things over the counter is when there are no safety issues. It's just a question of how well will they work. Well, they don't work very well. What could be done to make those products work better? The current products themselves, to say nothing about figuring out how to make the products perform better, meaning do a better job of delivering nicotine through the drug authorization process at FDA. And then finally, kids. If it's going to be a world where you have minimally or non-addictive levels of nicotine in the combustible products, but higher levels of nicotine in the other products, how do we think about youth initiation, where they could conceivably have access one way or the other to different nicotine-containing products? How concerned should we be about youth uptake of any of these products in that kind of environment? So the last thing that I want to cover is just some reflections on the current debate. As I said, there are inconvenient truths, and they abound, and they're on both sides. On the one hand, in a properly regulated marketplace, there is a role for heated and smokeless and e-cigarette products, and maybe one day flavored e-cigarettes. And we need to think seriously about the reality that some people may need to stay on less harmful forms of nicotine for a long time, and possibly forever, to avoid the lapse and the relapse. On the other hand, the law is clear It's not an abstract categorical discussion when it comes to market authorization. The companies have the burden of proof, and the reality is that the flavors are attractive to kids, and that depending upon the delivery vehicle, nicotine can be addictive. And the past marketing practices, not just of the cigarette companies, but of some e-cigarette companies, absolutely targeted young people. When was the last time any of those truths were acknowledged by anyone on either side of this debate? My view, the next time that it's acknowledged will be the first time. There really doesn't seem to be any interest whatsoever in the loudest mouths on both sides in any kind of effort to seek common ground. Even the search for principles. And there's a lot of noise, especially on Twitter, but it's an echo chamber. It accomplishes nothing. If the goal is some kind of common ground, if the goal is, let's see if we can bring the broader public health and tobacco control communities together, it ain't working. And what I see on Twitter basically every day is it's disturbing, but really the bottom line is it's unproductive, because all it is an echo chamber. It's a loud one, but at the end of the day, it's just a tunnel, it's contained, and it's just echo, and it's not getting through to the other side at all. So I'll leave you with, I got 5 new questions. What's it going to take to change all of this? Is this vision of a world where combustible products are no longer capable of creating or sustaining addiction, is that a goal that could possibly unify the combatants in the field? And if not, is there some other so-called endgame approach that can bring us together, that we can agree to? And if the answer to both of those questions is no, what about at least trying to identify some key principles that could drive everybody's day jobs in some kind of unifying way, rather than just the Twitter and the echo chamber? And what's it going to take, and I'm pointing the finger everywhere, not just one side or the other. What's it going to take to get a commitment that common ground, which has eluded us as the e-cigarette debate has taken off over the last 10 plus years? What's it going to take to get a commitment from the players to seek common ground? Because that's really what it would start with. It might not ultimately succeed, but a commitment to some kind of dialogue or process where agendas get checked at the door, and there's a genuine search for common ground, even if it's only in the form of principles, could possibly help. So despite the last 28 years of what I've tried to do, with varying degrees of success, I do remain optimistic. I will admit that I'm less optimistic than I have been in the past, though I still proudly wear this T-shirt that my kids got for me for a birthday years ago. It's just an odd drawing of a glass that's half full, and it doesn't even say half full. It's just a glass drawn half full. And maybe the glass is a little less than half full, the optimism glass, but I'm gonna try to remain optimistic, and I am, though honestly less optimistic than I have been. And in thinking about what to leave you all with at the end, I found a quote from someone who is not ordinarily associated with optimism. In fact, this is someone who is ordinarily associated with some of the greatest tragedies that have ever been written in the form of plays in the history of American theater, and that's Eugene O'Neill. And when we think about Eugene O'Neill, we just think about awful tragedies and the human condition and dysfunctional families and powerful emotional stuff, but we don't ordinarily think about him and his work as anything related to optimism. But I'll leave you with this. Eugene O'Neill wrote, "I am so far from being a pessimist. On the contrary, in spite of my scars, I am tickled to death at life." And I'll leave you with that, because with everything that he experienced in his life, if Eugene O'Neill could remain optimistic through the end of his days, then I'll try to also. Thank you all very much.